The book of Exodus, if all you know is Edward G. Robinson and Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, it's a great movie. I love that. I'm a movie guy. I love that movie. But you know, the story's even better if you go to the book's always better than the movie. That's true for this too. Exodus is the story of redemption and renewal of God's people. So let's do a little bit of background before we begin. So who wrote Exodus? Bella? Who wrote Exodus? Moses. Moses.
Oh, that's right.
Moses. Moses is the lawgiver. Moses is traditionally credited with writing what is called the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is the Greek word penta, five, the 5 books. But the Jewish word is the Torah. So when you hear the word Torah scholars, Jews who are Torah scholars don't study Isaiah and the Psalms. They study Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are other, of course, the Hebrew Bible continues, the Old Testament continues, and the Jews call it the Hebrew Bible, we call it the Old Testament. It's the same thing, and you're not being disrespectful when you call it the Old Testament. Call it what you're comfortable in calling it. But Moses is traditionally considered the author of the Pentateuch. Why? Because it says so. In fact, the very last chapter, Genesis, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the very last chapter says, and Moses is not writing this because he's dying. In other words, we have at the very last bit of Deuteronomy someone say, I'm finishing this off because Moses has just died. So it's sort of a hint that he didn't write this. Now, that's the traditional understanding. I'm persuaded by it. I'm persuaded that one hand lies behind this series of books. Now, why do I say that? From my studies, I find that there's a consistency of language, a consistency of grammar, a consistency of ideas. Well, wait a minute. In Genesis, we have 2 creation stories. We have sort of contradictions here and there. Doesn't that mean that this was basically compiled by editors and a committee in the back rooms of the temple in Jerusalem? Well, having served on committees too much of my life, it doesn't work that way. Committees don't produce the literary. See, the thing about, in the Hebrew language, Exodus is beautiful writing. This is the foundation of the modern Hebrew language. It is a literary classic. It tells stories. So when we say Moses is the author, well, Moses wasn't there around Abraham. Moses wasn't at creation. Moses could be the compiler in parts. He compiled the traditions about Genesis, about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wasn't born. He certainly was around during the story of Moses, and he was certainly through the rest of the time in the wilderness. So, there are different schools. There's the traditional school, which is that Moses is the editor/compiler and author. And then there are schools that Moses is the name of a collective. Moses is like Facebook, a huge, massive forum that thousands of people behind the scenes running the show. Does it matter? No, not really. Really doesn't matter. Because we're not Muslims. Now, of course we're not. But what does that mean? Islam believes that the Archangel Gabriel came to Muhammad, and Muhammad was the scribe, the secretary, who wrote down without error the Archangel's words about God and Revelation. So for Islam, if you challenge anything and say, well, that doesn't make sense, what you're basically saying is either I'm stupid because I don't understand the clear, pure words of God, or you're denying God is real. We don't do that with the Bible. The Bible was written by men, written down by men, who we believed were inspired. What does inspired mean? It means they were acting under the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, what does that exactly mean in real words? Let's take an example. I years ago, more than I care to remember, I worked on my doctoral dissertation was on John William Colenso. Of course, everybody knows who he is, don't you? See, that's the problem with academia. You have to pick the more and more and more and more obscure things to do something because all the good stuff's done. Colenso was an Englishman, even though his name was Colenso. He was from Cornwall. He's a Cornishman, who was the first bishop of Natal in South Africa. He went out to Africa in the 1850s, and he was there to convert the Zulus. And he learned Zulu, and his first job was to translate the Bible into Zulu. So he knew Hebrew, he knew Greek, and he's set to work, and he's translating the Old Testament into Zulu. And for the first time in his life, he began to say, hey, well, this stuff doesn't really make much sense. Colenso had been a mathematics scholar and had been a math teacher at a school called Harrow. He was part of the British establishment. He was a housemaster and math teacher at Harrow, and his brother was the chaplain to the Duke of something or other, and so the Old Boy Network got John William Colenso his big break. And Colenso, we'd call him an engineer's mindset. He had an engineer's mindset. I mean, we all know how... Carol, tell us how engineers' brains work. Will people look?
Sketchy, that's sketchy.
Okay. So Colenso's writing this down, he's thinking in English, reading in Hebrew, and then translating it into Zulu, and it says, the whole company of Israel assembled before the tent of meeting. He goes back a few pages, and it says there are almost 1 million people leaving Egypt. How could the whole company assemble before the tent of meeting? And Colenso, being a mathematician, assuming 18 inches per person. Seriously, assuming 18 inches per person, and so many ranks deep, the tent, a meeting, would have to be like 30 miles long. It doesn't make sense. In other words, Colenso took the logical conclusions of an engineer's brain, even though he was a bishop, to the Old Testament. He didn't say it was wrong, but he said, this doesn't make, we need to spiritualize this. And Colenso's problem, which I beautifully pointed out in my papers, was that he didn't understand that the Middle Eastern way of speaking, even to this day, is rather florid. I've shared with you my first training, when you study for the ministry, poor Erin has me as her training supervisory priest. Poor girl's going to be warped for life in the ministry. Well, I was warped for life because my first training supervisor was Samir Habibi, the only Palestinian Episcopal priest in the United States. Samir Habibi made Danny Thomas look tame and placid. Samir Habibi, this is the best dinner we've ever had. There are 1,000 people in this church that seat 75. Everything was Samir was just, the Cadillac is the greatest invention of modern science. Until he got his Mercedes. And the Mercedes, So there was a way of using language in ways that, or I hate to get political, it's like Donald Trump. You really don't take him seriously. You sort of follow his direction. You don't take, this is the bestest, I'm the most bestest, most wonderful president we've ever had. You don't really stop and say, well, wait, what about George Washington? That's not where he's going from. He's from Queens. This is how they talk in Queens. So when you read, so for Colenso, he didn't get it. And so he and the whole modern criticism of the movement said that, well, because of these conflicts, because of these exaggerations, because you've got the story here or there, it must have been put together by several hands. I don't know. That's a good argument. But it makes to me just as much sense that one hand put together all these things. And over the course of the centuries, scribes polished a bit here. I've been here now 4 years, and some of you have begun to hear the same sermon now a second time. And doesn't it get better the second time? Because I sort of cut off bits here. You see how these things operate? Because they're speaking of greater truths than engineering or science. The Bible is not a science book. It's not a diet book. It's not, it is to teach you how to live your life in communion and in fellowship with God. It's not the Quran. That's a major difference between our two faiths. You can question and wrestle with the Bible. Israel, we're not doing Genesis, but in Genesis you have the story of Jacob wrestling with God. And because he's wrestling, he's called Israel, because that's who's wrestling with God. The very notion. Now, what does wrestling with God means? I don't understand this. This doesn't work. This isn't fair. This isn't cruel. What is your plan and purpose? That whole mindset is foreign to Islam. But it's part and parcel of our Christian walk in life, of struggling with the Bible. So what does that mean to the start of here? If you read something and it makes no sense to you whatsoever, first off, you're not dumb. Okay? Some people have such a high view of the Bible that if they don't understand it, there must be something wrong with them. No. It means that you have either you're not thoroughly grounded enough, you can always read more, or that the spiritual truth that is trying to be imparted to you, you're just not able to hear it this time. When I was a brand new priest, I could tell people anything they wanted to know about child rearing. If you were good parents, your children would turn out great. Okay, I'm 55 now. How old are we?
56.
We're 56 now. And I got to tell you, you can be the best mother or father in the world, and it's still a crapshoot sometimes. So, in other words, you're different places and walks in your spiritual life and experience, and the Bible can speak to you. So when you read the Bible over the course of your life, it will say different things to you. All of a sudden you'll go, man, I get it. Man, I get it. And I want to start because we've got a wonderful example of that in the beginning. And let's just go, if you've got the handout, you'll be able to follow exactly what I'm saying. If you've got your Bible, you can follow along with Exodus 1:1. The story, there's been a break of 350 years from Genesis. Genesis ends with Joseph, remember the musical, many-colored dreamcoat?
Color.
Joseph is Pharaoh's chief aide. He's invited his brothers and his father, Jacob, down to Egypt. And the Jewish people, and Genesis tells us 70 of them, settled in Egypt. And now the story continues 350 years later. And in Hebrew, in the version I have, these are the names of the sons of Israel. In Hebrew, in the King James Bible, it says, now here are the names of. And in Hebrew, you can translate that into either now or and. So Exodus is, if you will, continuation. It's chapter 2, it's part 2. Nothing new is happening here. The story continues. 350 years later, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Who's 12? Joseph. 12 tribes of Israel. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. Now in the notes, in the handout, it says the sons of Israel B'nai Yisrael is how the Israelites are referred to in the Torah. B'nai, is that how I pronounce it? B'nai Yisrael?
B'nai,
B'nai.
sons of Israel.
We have a Hebrew scholar here, so I have to keep on my toes. And Israel means wrestling with God or struggling with God. That's the name that came after Jacob wrestled with God. And why? And the author, Dennis Prager, says, who's a rabbi, why should non-Jews care about the story of one of the smallest nations on earth? Because the Israelites' move to Egypt set the stage for two of the most important events in world history, the Exodus and the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And Prager goes on to say, even an atheist who believes not that there was no Ten Commandments, it's just a movie, we still have the story of God's redemption of his people and the deep moral, spiritual power that has, as well as the giving of God's law. So even if you don't think it really happened, you cannot dismiss the fact that these two events, real or imaginary, are probably the most important spiritual events before the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, I sort of want to ask people, who thinks that's true? Well, hey, the Greeks were model people, and the Egyptians had law, and I read about the Aztecs had this wonderful law, and, what's so special? How odd of God to choose the Jews. What's so special about the Jews? Now, should we start with the argument from Force, which is, well, God says so, no more argument? Yeah, but let's take another. What's different about this law, about this God of Israel?
Didn't Abraham God talked to Abraham and said, all your family will follow? From
Yes.
Genesis?
Abraham said, God said to Abraham, your descendants will be like the stars in the heavens. Excuse me? Sands on the beach. And he also said, they don't necessarily have to be your biological descendants. God said to Abraham earlier in Genesis that through your descendants, your people, the world will be saved. Yes, Bob, Rick.
Well, outside of the Jews, I don't believe anybody else believes in one God. Everybody else had multiple gods.
I'm trying to think of anyone who else, but I can't think of any. But yes, that's true. This is the first monotheistic religion that I'm aware of. Now, I have, yes.
I was going to mention that I think the difference is you have a history of prophecy in the Jewish faith, which doesn't seem to apply to other established civilizations.
It's an excellent point. God's prophecies. In other religions, you have people who get visions and dreams of God, but it's locally determined. In other words, it doesn't apply on a universal level. In other words, we have the Jewish prophecy, which comes more in detail in the prophets, of course, isn't, how should I put this? It's not Johnny Carson putting an envelope to his forehead and said, I see that the answer is, Dolly Parton. It's not something like that. It doesn't mean anything apart from the actual word, actual incident under investigation. The prophecies for Israel were about Israel for the greater good of all humanity. Now, Prager in his little book says that the West has been shaped by these beliefs. For instance, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, two of the founders of America, did not believe in a literal reading of the Bible. These guys were Episcopalians, I hate to say, but they were also deists. What is a deist? They were people that said the Bible is they're probably like most Episcopalians, I shouldn't say that. The Bible is a good moral book that guides us, but we don't really have to take it that seriously. You don't have to believe all that miracle stuff. You don't have to, But Franklin and Jefferson, who were moral men, but they weren't Christian men, were deeply influenced. So that when we had, now let's wave the flag, when we had the Declaration of Independence, they had a real debate over all men are created equal in the eyes of God. Now, why couldn't it would have saved ink to say men are created equal in the eyes of God. But they had a debate that all men, if you saw the musical 1776, whenever it last came around, one of the big...
Last week. It was on last week.
It was on the TV last week. There was the big debate, are slaves men? And there was that argument. It was a theological argument, yes. And the American Constitution was written acknowledging the fact that we're broken, that we've got to go along to get along, because unless we get the South Carolina to sign up, we're not going to have a united front against the British. But we need to understand that we are working from biblical, Old Testament, foundational statements that all men, and men not meaning men, but all people, are created equal. And where does this go back to? How odd of God to choose the Jews. It goes back to this. Let's keep moving, because we'll only get to verse 10 by the time if we keep this way. Verse 7, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly. Now, in our text, there's a little discursus about creation. Nahum Sarna, who was a very, very prominent Jewish theologian whose books I've read in school, talks about the Jews were God's third attempt to create a moral world. That doesn't make much sense. Well, think about this. God created Adam and Eve, and he put them in paradise. Didn't work, did it? They fell out of paradise. Then we have the new creation. We have, after paradise, what's the first action we record in Genesis? The murder, Cain and Abel. And this new world God created out into the world. God, it was wicked and corrupt, and we only have one man in his family, Noah, who are righteous. And so God pushes the reset button, saving Noah and his family and the creatures of this earth, and starts again. The third iteration at creating a moral nation, Professor Sarna argues, and I'm persuaded by this, was God's but God setting apart the Jewish people. God started off, Sarna would argue, by saying that everybody was good. Well, that didn't work. Then, okay, you're out of the Garden of Eden. Everybody can do what life leads them to do, and you know good and bad. That didn't work. Now we need a people who will be a vehicle for the salvation of the world. So Nahum Sarna writes that this, in other words, rise from 70 people over 350 years to millions is God's attempt to create a moral world. Now, there's another discursus, but I don't want to get into that too far. Why didn't God give the Ten Commandments to Adam and Eve? Well, actually, that's important. So I'll just sort of touch on what he writes. One might ask, why wouldn't God keep trying? Doesn't God know what works and what doesn't? Why would God have kept trying? Doesn't God know what's going to happen anyway? Why does he need to keep trying again? Why did he just begin the world with the Ten Commandments, or with the chosen people as conduits of his moral will? Prager responds in three ways. First, in creating a human being with free will, it is arguable that God could not predict what this creature would always do. Genesis 6:6 says that after seeing how much evil men do, God regretted that he had created men on earth. This is right before Noah's flood. God, these people are not turning out the way I wanted to. Any of you been on a car trip with your children who are just lovely at the start? They're not turning out the way I wanted them to. Now, some would argue that Genesis exists means that God doesn't know how people will turn out. Second, God made these multiple attempts at having people act decently to show why revelation was necessary and why specifically the revelation at Sinai in the Torah was necessary. Because previous events, the making of human conscience, Adam and Eve, and the basic moral Noah principles did not work. God gave the Ten Commandments and the Torah. We needed a rule book. We needed the rules posted on the wall. We needed the speeding limit posted because otherwise we would speed. So that's why God did this. And the third argument that Sarna puts forward is this attempt at making a good world establishes the reason for the Jewish people. Moses writes at Exodus 19, to be a nation of priests and a holy nation. Now, I'm going to jump ahead because this is my understanding of what we are as an Episcopal church. What? I thought being an Episcopal church meant that I wear these massively uncomfortable garments and that we all try to collect as much money from you guys as possible. No. Exodus 19. After the Ten Commandments have been brought down from the mountaintop. Remember the movie, Charlton Heston's got the bushy beard by this time. And I just had a brain freeze. Where was I going with that? I'm sorry.
Heston's got a long beard.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said that because that's... Oh, why am I Episcopalian?
There you go.
There we go. Exodus 16. You are to be a nation of holy priests. Well, when we have the golden calf incident, that didn't work. And so God set apart the tribe of Levi to be the priests. Because you needed a professional priest. You had the rule book, but now you needed the professionals to do it because the people wouldn't follow the rule book. In Peter's letters in the gospel, in Paul's letters, Paul tells us that as Christians, we are those successors of the Levites. We are a holy people. You ever hear about something called the priesthood of all believers? What does that mean? Does it mean all of you get to join the pension fund with me? No. What it means is that all of us are responsible for living and sharing the life and joy of Jesus Christ. We are, if you will, not some sort of medieval system, priests and peasants. We are all on the same level in God's eyes with that same commission to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Some of us have different roles. I celebrate the sacraments and preach. Deacon Kathy is set aside by the church to do the work of her office. So, within that, we have responsibilities and roles. But we're a church of priests. We're a nation of priests. We take this idea forward that comes from Sinai. So let's jump back into the book. As I said, we're only in verse 7. So the land was filled with them. Now, 350 years pass. They've had all these kids. Verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, Egyptian history tells us that there are dynasties. If you ever watch these Egypt specials, you'll hear about the 7th dynasty and this dynasty and that dynasty. What this means is that different families, different peoples, different tribes take control of Egypt. We've had a dynastic shift. History tells us that the Hyksos, which were a nomadic people, came and overthrew the existing pharaonic dynasty, and they stepped in its place. Egypt, like China and like the United States, was an unusual civilization in that when people moved there, they became Egyptians, or they became Chinese, in other words, when you moved into China, the Manchu dynasty were actually not Chinese, they're Manchurians. But when they conquered Peking, they became Chinese. When the Hyksos came into Egypt, they gave up being Hyksos and became Egyptians. So there's a new dynasty that does not know the past. The new king arose who did not know Joseph. Now, let's just stop there. I think this should probably be the motto of Susan's Sunday school. Now, hear me out. There was a new king who did not know Jesus. What does that tell us? The importance of passing on our history. Here, Joseph had saved Egypt from famine. He had preserved it from civil war. He had, in his own capacity, done great things. But because people stopped and didn't remember anymore, they didn't know their own history in the past. I'm appalled at it's a strong word, but I'm appalled at my children's ignorance about our country. They had a good education. They went to one of the best public high schools, Vero Beach High School in the state. And they were in the honors program. And Susan and I will have conversations with the girls, and we'll mention something, and it'll be like, I'm talking about medieval India. It's American history, in essence, stops with the Pilgrims, or, it stops with the Civil War. Laura, I made the joke, Laura, you're a brave girl to go to Cambodia. When I was your age, I wouldn't have thought of going to Cambodia. Why? Well, there's a war for about, 20 years. I don't know when it began, but it ended in 1974. I was 12 at the time, so I wasn't. But I remember watching the TV with the helicopters lifting off from Saigon, and then 2 years later, or a year later, you start hearing the stories of Pol Pot. And Laura's with a bunch of her these are girls who go to a very expensive private university. These are really bright kids. And Laura and her little girly friends are in Phnom Penh, and Laura, at Susan's urging, Susan said, go to the museum in Phnom Penh. Oh, well, my friends want to go get sun or something. So she skipped going to the museum where she would have learned that a third of the country was murdered in 2 years under the communist regime. I mean, I could be talking science fiction to her sometimes. I mean, there's just such an ignorance. And I can talk about my children like this, not your children, but I think we all experience this. If we don't teach our kids, what does that mean? Did you see these little statistics where, like, if you ask people what they think of communism, like people over the age of 65, only 1 out of 50 thinks it's a good idea, where those between 18 to 25, a third thinks it sounds great? Oh, well, there's a little thing like hundreds of millions of people dead, but, they don't know that. So what we're seeing here is this is what Talmudic scholars and Torah scholars do. They take these lines and they parse them and they look at them to see, how does this speak to us more than just a lead-in into a story? So what do you think of that? I mean, how do you, so we're, as I said, we're sort of doing a Jewish reading. A king who did not arose, who did not know Joseph. What do you think about that forgetting of our history?
King of Egypt, that's the Pharaoh we talking about.
Yes. Are we in danger of forgetting our history?
Yes.
Yes.
Whenever I tell people that our old churches up north in Philadelphia had slave galleries, they look at me like I'm a kook. When I tell people, oh, well, down in Fort Pierce, there are 2 Episcopal churches about a quarter of a mile apart. Why? One is white, one is black. Why? Because when they were built at the teens of the last century, you had the church for the white people, the church. I mean, our children don't know this. Or what they do is a sort of a distorted way. Or it's an overly romanticized struggle. So the importance, Susan, of Sunday school is passing on this knowledge and belief that we have. Isn't that right, Beth? Yeah. And Pharaoh said to his people, "Look, the Israelites are too much numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that it may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." Now we'll go into Talmudic and Jewish debate. Can anybody think of a country or a place that is having a similar issue? What about Southern California? There are too many Mexicans around who don't know our history, who are not like us. We need to do something, need to do it now, or this won't be Orange County anymore. It will be Naranjal County. The Egyptians are having the same fears that some people in the United States have about I don't want to talk about immigration politically, but I'm just saying that people don't change. Pharaoh has forgotten what the Jews have done. They've been here for 350 years, and all of a sudden, he's worried that these people who have kept their own religion, they've kept themselves separate, but they've integrated into society as pretty much well as they can, they're going to join with the invaders and kick us out of power. So we've got to do something to cut down on the number of Jews. Is this something that you could recognize in our world today? A fear like that?
Sure. White supremacy.
Yeah. Have you read the news in Denmark? Denmark and Sweden have problems with immigration. They were very liberal for a long time in allowing anybody off the boat from Afghanistan and Syria in. So that today 15% of the people living in Sweden are not actually Swedish. They are from the Middle East and Asia. And Denmark has a similar problem, and so the Danes have basically have created what they call ghettos. Unless you're going to assimilate, meaning become Danish, don't have to believe anything, but you have to dress normally, you have to ride on the bus, act like all the other Danes, we're going to have you live in ghettos. And because you don't pick up your trash, your children are noisy, you marry your girls when they're 12, you do female genital mutilation, you're not being good Danes. The Danish response is say, okay, this is terrible, and if you're going to be this way, we're going to move you into certain ghettos. Now for us, Americans, we hear that, and that's horrifying, isn't it? To me, it sounds horrible, because to my mind, I have to think of the Nazi ghettos or the slums of our major cities, not allowing people free movement. But for the Danes, they sort of reached the point where Muslim immigration is so bad, it's so destabilizing, they got to do something. So it's the same, what happened 3,000 years ago in Egypt. You can see hints of this in Denmark today, in Southern California, and all these other places. People are people are people. And that's one of the reasons why this book is so powerful, because it speaks these underlying continuous truths. Let us deal shrewdly with them so they may not increase, otherwise in the event of war they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rising from the ground. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they were increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They turned the Israelites. Anybody been to Indian Town? Do you know where that is? Stewart. Do you know where Stewart is? In Florida? For my sins, I once served in Indian Town, which Okeechobee is a thriving, bustling metropolis. Indian Town is halfway between Stewart and Lake Okeechobee. Indian Town is where the giant migrant worker camps are. where you've got 10,000 men living in barracks who work for U.S. Sugar, or for the orange groves, who are bussed all across the state. We don't see them because they're basically pocketed in certain places. Now, that's done by corporate America. People basically will give you a place to live, you can shop at the company store, you don't have to speak English, and the immigration police never bother Indiantown. So you go, there are places like Indiantown all throughout the United States. You can go to North Carolina, where there are places where the people who pick the pickles for the panning factories live in sort of isolated, segregated communities. This is what the Egyptians tried, but they already had the Jews there, so they moved all the people, husband, families in there. And the more they concentrated them, these damn Jews kept having more kids. These nasty, and their cooking smelled, and it was awful. The more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Verse 13, the Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made perform them. Ruthlessly they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and brick, with all sorts of tasks in the field. You remember the movie, Ten Commandments, Charlton Heston? And C.B. DeMille, the director, took a little bit of license and he made the Pharaoh, he called him Ramesses, whereas the name of the city they were building was Ramesses. And he had Sir Cedric Hardwicke, the actor who played Pharaoh. Charlton Heston presents to him this city named after you, built by these slaves. And you have the scenes of the Hebrews making bricks, standing in mud piles, trying to mix straw and clay to make bricks. This was what the Old Testament tells us the Jews were forced to do. At the various labors that they made them perform, ruthlessly they made life bitter for them, harsh labor at mortar and bricks with all sort of tasks in the field. Now we get to what I find is the interesting part. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Now here's a little grammar bit. Are they Jewish midwives, or are they Egyptian midwives who serve the Hebrews? And that's a language issue here. I'm inclined to think that they were Egyptians who served the Hebrew population. These are nurses, midwives. And Pharaoh, and we actually have the name of the first two nurses in history are named. Shiphrah and Puah. Puah is now a common Jewish Hebrew name in Israel. Shiphrah, I haven't seen this much, but these names are honored. So 3,000 years later, these two women are still honored by having children named after them. And when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If he's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt told them. They let the boys live. So the king summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous. Before the midwife came to them, they can give birth." We're going to go back into this, but I want to tell the story at once. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Now that's the end of verse 1, and we start with the story of Moses. But I want to come back to the Hebrew midwives. We have Egyptian women. You notice who is never named. C.B. DeMille came up with a name, but who does the Bible not name?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh. And who is named by the Bible? The midwives. Two, if you will, not very important people in the great scheme of things. And these midwives were liars. They were told to abort or commit a infanticide. And they came up with a great story. Now, one of the things the Nazis would do is they could get salve their conscience by saying these Jews, these Poles, these Gypsies, they were really animals. And they treated people like animals. And when you demean people, when you hate another group or race, what is the natural thing? To sort of almost make them animals in your mind. And so the Pharaoh was told pretty much a whopper of a lie. These animals, these Jewish women, man, they just pop them out. They're not refined like us Egyptians who need, is it an epidural or? Yes, they don't need these things. They don't need all this stuff. They just pop them out. And Pharaoh believed it. Now, first off, let's ask the question. Why do I think that these were Egyptians? Well, first off, because Pharaoh just didn't chop their heads off. He talked to them about this. Why are you not doing what I'm telling you to do? So it's sort of he's telling people to murder, and if they don't do it, well, if you're that sort of guy, you usually murder the people you tell to murder. But he didn't. He asked them questions. Why are you doing this? And they tell an outrageous lie that Jewish women are so primitive. They just are happy working away in the fields. They squat, pop, out comes the baby, then they're back to work again. Well, we Egyptians go through all this pre- and perinatal stuff. And then it goes on to say, and God rewarded these two women. This begins a long ethical history of when can you lie? Because these two women lied, and the Bible says these two women were honored by God for lying. We know the names of two women liars who are honored by God. They were rewarded. What does it say exactly? The midwives said, let me turn to the page. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Bella, is it wrong to lie? Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Oh, not asking, I'm telling you. And I'm sure your parents would say the same thing. But we have now the introduction of what is called situational ethics. Now, this is a very fraught area. When is it okay to lie? When is it right? Yes.
Verse 17 says, let the midwives fear God. They did not do as the king of Egypt.
Yes. I lost my train of thought. No,
When
no.
is it okay to lie?
When is it okay to lie? Now, in the Christian tradition, we fought this, and one of the slurs Protestants sling at Catholics, have you ever heard someone is being Jesuitical? What does that mean? Well, for a good Protestant, it means that they're being so damn clever that they're lying because they think they are doing a good thing by lying. Catholics don't use that phrase, but Protestants use that phrase about Catholics. You're being Jesuitical. Islam has a doctrine of talika or tariqa, where it is permissible to lie to non-believers, which is different. We won't get into that. But here in Israel, in Islam, in the Jewish religion, God is telling us it's okay to lie. But why? Is it because it's convenient? Or is it because, as Kathy says, they feared God? What's going on here? When is it okay to tell a lie?
For the greater good.
When you see, this is a joke, when you see a really ugly infant, you're like, oh, how cute. But, sorry, that's off topic.
Are you thinking of anyone in particular? Or no?
No.
Oh, you look great in that dress. Yes, that's an acceptable lie to tell. Well, there are little white lies, but I'm not talking about that. Anyone know who Corrie ten Boom was? Corrie ten Boom her father was a watchmaker. She was learning the trade in the Nazis, and she was a devout Christian. and the Nazis invaded Holland. And she resisted and rejected the Nazis' dehumanization, destruction of the Jewish people, because it was just plain wrong. She was involved in hiding Jews from the Gestapo and the Dutch police. But she had a terrible moral crisis, because they would ask her, have you any Jews in the attic? And she was trained never to lie. Now, if she said yes, what would happen?
Yeah.
Whole family would be dead, not, you know, the family upstairs, plus her family. So she had to lie to save people. And for her, this is a great moral crisis. And for her, she found an answer in this passage. And what the Christian tradition has taught is that, no, it's not okay to lie. You should never lie. But when you have, when lives are at stake, when there is a question of competing truths and evils, you must always choose the greater good. Did you understand what I'm trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
It would have made Corrie ten Boom a perfectly content martyr to say, oh yes, I have Jews in the attic, so shoot me. She'd go to heaven, because, you know, she kept her word. But she felt, in her own heart, she felt, I forget, in her book I read about it, she almost likened it to being defiled in some ways. Because she was so proud of being such a good girl. And she was making a deliberate choice not to be a good girl. But she came to understand that God's will is not that we all be good boys and girls, but we be there, a nation of priests. A nation of priests being good for the whole world. So God is blessing lying in this particular situation. Situational ethics has a long history. Yes, Kathy?
But we have to be careful not to look at the greater good for me. The greater good is for God's people and how to follow God's words rather than government or whatever. But it's not for my greater good.
Exactly, and this comes into many of the issues that our country is dealing with today. The greater good would be all these old people with dementia, all the people at the Key Center, they just die. Save the country a lot of money. Emotionally, I'd be sad, but, you know, I'd get over it quickly. And this is sort of the euthanasia debate. If you start saying to people, Granny, you're allowed to kill yourself, and you know, it makes life so much easier for ourselves. And I know that's an evil thing to say, but for those who've been in that experience, it's true. Where you basically are caring for someone, and in your heart of hearts, you just wish it's over. Now, what pressure does that put on if they're still with it? Don't you think they know that? That, you know, that they don't want to be a burden?
I'm going through that right now.
Tell us about it, Dave.
My mom came home from hospice last week, and she last night, for example, she said, take me home, take me home. She wasn't talking about hospice. She was talking about with Jesus. She said, she basically said, I want to die, essentially. And Dad and I looked at her and we were like, we can't do that. We can't do that. That's illegal. We can't. She basically wanted us to Kevorkian her, to put it, in that term. So it's it's a very difficult thing to go through. Yes, as you pointed out, George. Yes, it is an easy way out, but it's not the right way.
Yeah.
It can't be the right way, and it's easy.
So in this situational ethics, the greater good economically is to euthanize people, but it comes at the expense of life. Does anyone remember a TV show called Yes, Minister? It's a British comedy of the 70s, one of my favorite shows of all time. There's a character named Sir Humphrey Appleby, who's the British typical archetype of a civil servant. And there's a wonderful episode where they're discussing taxes on cigarettes. And the prime minister, whose name in the series is Jim Hacker, says, well, we really should make smoking illegal, in fact, ban the sale of cigarettes. And Sir Humphrey Appleby says, no, we get so much money out of this. And besides, these people who smoke, if they didn't smoke, they'd live longer, so it would cost the Treasury more, because they'd live another 10 years. These people are laying down their lives for the good of the country by smoking, and we don't want to mess this up. And logically and economically, he's right. We should encourage smoking, because then people will save Social Security. They'll all drop dead at 62 of heart attacks before they collect. But that's a greater good. But is that the true good? Which is it? Is it life? Pope John Paul II had a long debate or series of articles about when is it right, when is it appropriate to steal? Should a woman ever become a prostitute because that's the only way she can support her family and her children? These are real world issues. And we have to ask ourselves, at times, yes, you need to steal. If the choice is your child is going to die right now, and there's no other thing to do that you can do, in this unique circumstance, God will forgive you, because you're doing this for the preservation of life. Stealing is wrong. It's forbidden by the Ten Commandments. Let's take something closer to Jesus Christ says, I hate divorce. The Catholic Church has said that means, sorry, end of discussion. And our tradition, the Protestant tradition, says yes and no. There are circumstances when it is better that people separate because somebody might die. You know, when I was, priests are given these little, we have these cheat sheet books. And reading that, I look at them in the library, the priestly manuals from the 40s. I would look at when I was in seminary in the early 90s. And basically, if your husband was beating you, you just basically needed to
Leave.
no.
Suck it up.
Pray.
Suck it up. Suck it up.
Pray.
You just needed to basically say, pray that the Lord will incline his heart to mercy, and if you show him mercy, the Lord will show mercy to you. I don't think that's moral myself. I think that's manipulating people. So if you ask me, should you get divorced? I hope not. I hope it never comes to that. But are you now an evil person? No, sometimes divorce is the better course. This is called situational ethics. And it's a very tricky field because clever people can twist this
That's right.
for their own benefit. I think we've all know glib people who can basically make anything look wonderful. My kids in high school had friends who could convince Laura and Claudia, it's a great idea to go swimming in the river at midnight. You know, what a wonderful thing to do. But it's not the right thing to do. So where we have here, we're just in the opening chapter. Nothing has happened except the first government-ordered abortion program, with the midwives refusing to go along, telling a great big whopper of a story that Pharaoh's dumb enough to buy because he thinks the Jews aren't really full human beings. They just pop out babies with no trouble. God rewards the liar. Why? Because the liars were doing this not for personal gain, not for prestige, not to make their life easier, but they were, because, as Kathy read that passage, they feared the Lord. The law is telling them to do this. They know God is telling them to do that. Chatting with my daughter Laura when she was thinking about areas of specialty in medicine, in nursing, she's always been baby crazy. but she did not want to go into obstetrics because she never wanted to have to place herself in having to do a rotation in how to do abortion. Or it's just, she just wouldn't do it. So she switched to neonatal care after the baby's out because Laura could not, in good conscience, and her good conscience comes from Susan, nothing to do with me, of aborting a child because it has Down syndrome. For her, that was just, you know, yeah, they'll only live to their 40s. Yes, they have a diminished quality of life. Yes, it's expensive. And we all know people 70, 80 years old who have people, they're worried about who's going to take care of my kids when I die. That's still not an excuse to murder a baby. So situational ethics is introduced in this topic, and it's been talked about for 3,000 years ever since. And next week, we start the story of Moses, and it becomes even more exciting. But